I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speakers, Lynne and Jim Weber, both master naturalists, authors. They retired from 30 plus years at IBM, longtime Austin, NIPSOT chapter members and certified Texas master naturalists. Lynne's a past president of the Central Texas area, Texas Master Naturalist chapter. And the Webers are dedicated naturalists who have been studying Texas history since they moved to Austin in 1989. They've served on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve Citizen Advisory Council, as well as on the boards of the Big Bend Natural History Association, Big Bend Conservancy, and the Chihuahuan Desert Research Institute. They conduct golden cheek warbler and Colima warbler surveys, lead guided hikes, restore native habitats, map and remove invasive plants, and are stewards of an 8-acre preserve that is part of the Balcones Canyonland Preserve. Their nature photography and writing appear on Flickr and on their monthly blog, as well as in several nature publications. They've co-authored 5 books, all published by Texas A&M University Press, and their most recent book, as I said, Naturalist Austin, A Guide to the Plants and Animals of Central Texas, being offered at a 20% discount. I used their book on the butterflies just yesterday, trying to identify a butterfly. So I did get it down to the right species. I don't remember now. Let's see. I can't remember the genus, but it helped. So with that, Lynne and Jim Weber.
Okay, as we said, we're going to talk about native host plants for Texas butterflies and moths. So we're going to start out kind of big picture, talking about the native plant diversity of Texas. Of course, why natives are important, which were just touched on initially. What's the difference between a host plant and a nectar plant? What's the difference between butterflies and moths in general? What's the life cycle stage like? So you can recognize it. What's the difference between a chrysalis and a cocoon? How do butterflies and moths find their mates? And then once they've mated, how do they find the host plants? And then Jim will take you through the host plant species accounts, where he selected certain native plants and the butterflies and moths that use them. And then we'll wrap up with some gardening for butterflies and moths and talk a little bit about some of our photography. So the plant diversity of Texas. Texas has one of the highest number of plant taxa in the United States. We're second only to California. We have more than 6,000 species, and that includes subspecies and variations, and more than 4,600 of those are native. In terms of butterflies and moths, there's about 500 species of butterflies that occur in Texas, the most in the US, and about 4,700 moth species. There are some moth species and their host plant associations that are still being discovered. So as citizen scientists and interested folks, you may be able to contribute to that. Butterflies and moths utilize many different types of plants, so it isn't just flowers. Of course, trees, shrubs, wildflowers, grasses, and vines. There are some that actually use lichen and algae for their caterpillars to eat. And in Florida, which is one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard of, there is the gopher tortoise moth that caterpillars feed their scavengers, obligate scavengers, and they actually feed on the keratin of the shells from dead gopher tortoises. Plants, by the way, are the principal factor for dictating butterfly and moth distribution. Why natives? Well, this was touched on also in the introductory remarks, but native plants are at risk from human causes. There's industrial scale agriculture. So all these former native plant communities are vanquished for agriculture. We have Roundup ready crops, which keeps native plants from growing, and things that they call weeds. We're increasingly paving over the earth and land. And as environmentalist Rupert Cutler said, asphalt is the land's last crop. We have an obsession with lawns. There's an estimated 40 million acres of exotic turf grasses in the US. And it's irrigated by more than 2/3 of our municipal water. So we're using potable water to irrigate our landscapes. We use heavy chemical usage to get rid of weeds. Now what's in vogue now is mosquito spraying, which is an equal opportunity killer. It will kill what you don't want as well as what you do want. And of course, there's noise pollution to maintain those lawns from mowers, edges, and blowers. And another threat, of course, to native plants are that they're being displaced by non-native invasives. So why are natives important to our ecosystems? They provide what's called essential services. They help us to reclaim the land. They help us to produce and preserve the soil. They protect our waterways. They're easy to grow, they're hardy, and they're adapted to our climate, relatively disease-free once they are established. And most importantly, and what we're touching on here, is that they create habitat for our insects and all of our plants and birds and other wildlife. They're an integral part of the natural nutrient cycle. In other words, if an insect has evolved by using a certain plant, you can't get rid of that plant, replace it with another, and it'll be just fine. That breaks the actual cycle. And most importantly, and I think Lady Bird Johnson was one who gave this message, which is that native plants are beautiful reminders of our natural heritage here in Texas. Host plants and nectar plants are a little different. Lots of times when people put in butterfly or moth gardens, they'll only consider nectar plants, but host plants are just as important for that life cycle. They are the plants that the female butterflies and moths deposit their eggs on, and it's what their caterpillars eat. And many of the butterfly and moth species require specific host plant species. Nectar plants, on the other hand, are plants that are food sources for the adult butterflies and moths. They provide ample nectar, and these insects prefer ones that have big landing platforms. Think of things like American basket flower. Nectar source selection, unlike larval plant selection or host plant selection, is much less specific. So many different species can nectar on many different types of nectar plants. In terms of the differences between butterflies and moths, in general, the antennae of butterflies have a small club at the end, whereas with moths, they're usually feathery or sawtoothed and thread-like, and I'll get to the reason why that is in a bit. The abdomens on butterflies tend to be slender and smoother, whereas on moths, they tend to be plump and hairy. Again, these are generalizations. Butterflies are typically diurnal, which means during the day they're active, but some are crepuscular or active at dawn and dusk. And the moths are typically nocturnal or active at night, but there are a few that are day flyers. In their pupal stage, or in the last stage before they actually emerge as adults, butterflies form a chrysalis in general, and moths will form a cocoon. And it's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that the number of moth species outnumber butterfly species by about 15 to 1. In terms of the life cycle, you're probably all familiar with this when people talk about it in terms of the monarch butterfly. But eggs are first laid and can be laid either singly or in multiples, depending on the species. The larva or the caterpillar will hatch. They begin to feed, and the first meal is usually the actual egg because it's full of protein. They're often found on different parts of the plants, and they will eat using various techniques. As it grows, it actually sheds its skin, and it goes through what's called several phases or instars, and those are the phases between two periods of molting. The final instar then pupates, and as I mentioned before, if it's a butterfly, it forms a chrysalis, and if it's a moth, it forms a cocoon, although sometimes these things will pupate either on the ground or underground, and it depends on the species. The adult will then emerge, or what's called a closing, and some species, both moth and butterfly, don't feed as adults. They only exist to mate. The chrysalis and cocoon are different in terms of how they look and where you'll find them. Chrysalises, again, are the pupal stage of butterflies, and although some butterflies actually pupate in plant roots and stems or in pods. It's from the Latin, the word chrysalis is from the Latin meaning gold, and it refers to the metallic-like coloration that you usually see on them. And it's a hardened case, and you usually find it in the open. Often it is attached by a silken pad spun by the caterpillar with hooks on its abdomen, and it will hook into that pad and hang from the host plant. Cocoons, on the other hand, are the pupal stages of moths, although some moths will pupate underground in a dirt chamber. It actually is from medieval French and it means eggshell or shell. It's usually soft but tough silk, and it's usually a silken case that's camouflaged by bits of debris or vegetation, often the host plant. And it is usually found in a more concealed location. So now that you know a little bit about that, let's talk a little bit about how they find a mate. Butterflies can actually somewhat recognize each other from a distance. They can tell by the movement or the size or the color or even the shape that it might be a potential mate. And at close range, they actually use pattern recognition. But more importantly, the females will sense with their antennae the pheromones or the external hormones that are excreted by the males. Moths are similar, but kind of opposite. It's the females that release the pheromones from a gland on the tip of their abdomens. And of course, like the butterflies, the scent is species specific. And the male actually from miles away can use receptors on his antenna called sensilla. If you take a look at the insets on the left-hand upper side of the page, the little inset at the very top shows the antenna of the female, which are very thread-like. But the antenna on the male are much more wide and fan-like, almost like pieces of coral. And the reason for that is so that the surface area is increased and the male can then sense the pheromones that the female releases. So now that they find each other, they mate. And how do they find their host plants? Well, first of all, you should know that insects that eat plants are called phytophagous. And there are many other insects that eat plants, not just butterflies and moths. And those that eat more than one species or type of plant is called philophagous. And those that eat one species or type of plant are called monophagous. So the most famous monophagous species is the monarch butterfly that uses milkweeds. Pelaphagous butterfly would be something like a gray hair streak that can use many different species as its host plant. What we do know about how they actually find host plants is that they utilize the smell and taste. They actually have receptors. The butterflies have them on their legs, and the moths have them on their legs and on their antennae. So if you see a butterfly that's actually flitting around, touching plants, and then getting up quickly and flying around, touching plants, it's usually a female that's looking for a host plant. What we don't know is if they use any visual cues, if they have a memory as to where host plants might be, or even if they try to find stands of host plants that grow in abundance so they can increase the survival of their offspring. All right, so we've given you a little bit of an introduction. So Jim's now going to take you through some of the species counts for butterflies and moths. And as Doug Tallamy, who I think most of you know of anyway, he said that trees tend to host the most. So we're going to start out, I think, with trees.
Okay, y'all hear me okay? All righty, okay. Some of y'all may have seen kind of the gist of this before, but this is the format of our two host plant books, basically, with a little bit of a difference. On the left-hand side, we show main plant pictures and then detail shots of either a flower or seed head or something like that. And then a range map of what counties in Texas the plant occurs in, overlaid on the ecoregion map. And then for the purpose of this presentation, on the right-hand side, we'll show some plant information, some butterfly and moth information, and then pictures of the adult and caterpillar. And down at the bottom in green, we may have some additional species of butterflies and moths that might use this particular plant. By no means is this exhaustive. There's a lot of plants, a lot of butterflies and moths that use some of these things, and you can't really list them all. So for the first one we wanted to highlight is black cherry. It's one of our favorite trees in Texas. We have some in our backyard, the escarpment black cherry for Central Texas. It blooms these beautiful white flowers. It has these great looking cherries, turns a nice color yellow in the fall. Bark is interesting. It's just a great looking tree, and everybody in Central Texas should have one in their yard. There are two other varieties other than escarpment around the state. The southwestern black cherry or choke cherry out in West Texas, and then the eastern black cherry in the eastern part of the state. The species we highlighted on this are eastern tiger swallowtail, which is a good-looking large swallowtail butterfly, yellow with nice dark stripes on it. The female version of this butterfly can occur in a dark form that looks a lot like a black swallowtail or a pipevine, but if you see it backlit, you can still see the black stripes in the wing, even though the wing is basically black. So it can be a little tricky. But and the white furcula is a moth that uses black cherry. It's in the prominent family, and their caterpillars have this interesting characteristic of inflating or pushing fluid into their hind prolegs, which are on the lower picture there, and it's in the back end of the caterpillar, but it extends out these its back prolegs like their arms or antennae and waves them around to try to scare away predators, which is kind of cool. And then striped hair streak, red spotted purple. There are a few other Cecropia, a few others that will use black cherry. It's a great tree. In the willow family, black willow is the largest of the willow trees that we have, usually multi-trunked, kind of a weak tree, but fast growing, likes wet areas. A couple butterflies and moths that use that. The viceroy is a monarch mimic, looks a lot like a monarch, mainly so that it doesn't get eaten. It doesn't have the bad taste that a monarch gets from eating milkweed, but it benefits by trying to look like a monarch. And then the Isle moth, we show here the picture of the Isle moth is the female, which is kind of an orangey purple color. The male has a yellow, bright yellow forewings, so it looks a little bit different. We may see that later. And the one thing to know about the Isle moth, it eats a lot of different plants, but it also has stinging hairs on the caterpillar, so it's not one you want to pick up and pet because you'll be kind of sorry you did that. Texas ebony is a great South Texas tree, generally multi-trunked evergreen. It's kind of these small roundish leaves, zigzaggy gray branches, and the hard, very hard dark brown wood. They have these big legumes on them that start out green, the seed pods, turn brown, stay on the tree through the winter. The large orange sulfur is one of the butterflies that uses that. It's a good looking, fairly large sulfur. And then the black witch moth, which is one of the more famous moths around the state. It'll eat a few other things in the pea family, but it likes this. The black witch is kind of a large moth. It is about, I think, about the size 6 inches across. It's almost like seeing a bat flying around your porch light if you have one. It's a pretty good big dark moth. And there are a couple little myths about it. One, it was called the butterfly of death, or the Mariposa de la Muerte, because it was rumored that if one flew into your house, somebody in there was going to die. So you didn't want that. But then the other more modern myth is that it's called the money bat or something like that. And the rumor there is if one lands and perches above your front door, you're going to win the lottery. Now, a few years back, we did have one land over our front door, but we didn't buy a lottery ticket to test that out. Kind of sorry I didn't. But there are other butterflies and moths that use this, Cassius blue, coyote cloudy wing. This Blanchard royal moth that we mentioned at the bottom is critically imperiled, but it's a good looking kind of yellow moth and very isolated range down to like sable palm area in Brownsville. Honey mesquite kind of is everywhere. This very common tree. It hasn't really increased its range since human settlement, but there are more of them, mainly due to cattle raising. The lining of the legumes on this pea family plant, kind of sweet tasting, and you can grind them into a flour like meal. And Lynn and I have sampled that out in West Texas. That's actually kind of caramel tasting and tasty. Highly recommend it. The marine blue butterfly uses this, lays its eggs on the buds, and the larva will eat the flowers and then subsequent seed pods. And this Hylobrot's silk moth, or the bloodshot-eyed moth, at the bottom here is one of the silk moths. It's kind of a medium-sized silk moth, but one of those that does not eat as an adult. The caterpillar makes up for it, eats a bunch, but the adult does not eat anything and only lives about a week or 10 days. There are a lot of different butterflies and moths that will use honey mesquite as well. Texas live oak, Quercus fusiformis, not to be confused with Quercus virginiana, but there's a lot of oaks in Texas, and they're all generally pretty good host plants. This is one of the signature oak trees in Texas. It's semi-evergreen. This time of year, it's starting to look kind of crappy as it sort of loses its leaves and starts thinking about the next crop, but it's a great tree to have in your yard. And a few things that use that are, of course, the Meridian dusky wing, one of the dusky wing skippers, kind of a brown, medium-sized butterfly, kind of hard to ID sometimes, the skippers, but it likes this. And the Grody's buck moth at the bottom here is kind of a cool little creature that it's one of those, it's a small silk moth, so it's only around as an adult a short period, but they have these flight times in the late fall, early winter, and you can find them then, and then that's it, other than getting lucky and finding a caterpillar in the spring. We have had one of these on the street out in front of our house. Post oak, another great oak tree for a good chunk of the state. Slow growing, kind of a medium-sized oak. Wood has been used for flooring for white oak. Kind of resistant to decay, and it's evolved with thicker bark to help be fire resistant. The northern version of the oak hair streak is the one that we have here, which always seems kind of backwards. It seems like we should have the southern oak hair streak, but that's not how it works out. So we have the northern oak hair streak, and it overwinters as an egg laid on an oak twig. Then it ends up popping out this May as a little adult. The Polyphemus moth, one of the big silk moths, 5 or 6 inch wingspan. Another one that does not eat as an adult, but it's an impressive moth. And the caterpillar is kind of impressive too. They can get pretty good size, look like a little crawling green hot dog on your tree. And the color of green on that thing is just fabulous. But it'd be a mouthful for somebody. Eastern cottonwood is another tree that's very popular in the populus family. It's a large tree. We have one next to our house. I kind of worry about how big it's going to get over time, but it's often grows near water. They can get ginormous, and they put out a lot of these cottony seeds, and we end up, sometimes it almost looks like on a porch that there's been a snowfall. There's so much of it, but it's kind of a fun tree to have, and it can get very large. Morning cloak is one of the butterflies that uses this. It's a great looking butterfly. The caterpillars are kind of gregarious. Usually they'll be feeding in a little mini crowd. So usually don't see one by itself. And then the modest sphinx on the sphinx side. In general, the Sphingidae do eat as adult, but this is one that does not. It's a big sphinx moth and a good looking one. Eastern tiger swallowtail, red spotted purple viceroy, some others will also. Sugar hackberry. It's one of those trees that we like to, in these books, we kind of like to defend the less popular species, the maligned species. Yeah. sometimes, it's good to see that they do have a purpose. There is a reason for these being in the ecosystem and being native. Sugar hackberry trees, one people don't necessarily want to have in their yard, but they get a lot of use. They're a deciduous tree, pale gray bark. They get these warty or corky little patches on the bark. And yeah, it's not really a trash tree though, because it does provide good food for wildlife. The berries, the birds love, that's how the trees get spread around so easily. But there's a family of hackberry butterflies, hackberry emperor, tawny emperor, emperor salalia, and the snout butterfly all use just hackberries. So that's a good source of food for them. And this gorgeous little white flannel moth at the bottom, which is kind of hard to see white on white, but it is a fabulous little moth for South Texas. And the caterpillar is kind of cool looking too. And I have to say, in a lot of cases, the caterpillars sometimes are better looking than the adults. Speaking of maligned plants, this one's our all-time favorite, I have to say. Ash juniper. They get so much bad press, but this is really a great tree. It's native, in spite of what people like to say. Yeah, maybe it can be a little invasive if left to its own devices, but this belongs here, and it's not a cedar. There are no cedars in Texas, naturally. This is a juniper, named after William Willard Ash, one of the early foresters of the U.S. Forest Service. And there are a few specific butterflies and moths that use this. The juniper hairstreak, appropriately enough, uses this tree as its host plant, and its only host plant in Central Texas. And it's one of the most beautiful little small butterflies that are in the area. Green and kind of an orangey brown with some white markings. It's really a very good looking butterfly. And I will say we had a hard time finding caterpillars for this one. This is
They're small.
they're small for one thing. They're probably less than 1 inch long, but they are so cryptic. And when they're sitting on the foliage of the tree, they are really easy to miss. In fact, we had a potted juniper tree that we were taking pictures of this caterpillar on that a friend of ours was rearing. And we took a few minute break to look at what we had taken to see if we liked them or not and wanted to take some more while we would go back to look for the thing. It took us like 15 minutes to find it, and it hadn't moved. It's just really hard to spot. And that's true with a lot of these caterpillars. They're amazingly cryptic. The Van Buskirk's sphinx is a more recent split off of Dahl's sphinx. It's sort of an eastern western thing, but the Van Buskirk sphinx is the one we have here in Central Texas. It too has a caterpillar that is very cryptic and easy to miss on the juniper trees. Spice bush, a little bit more maybe of an East Texas hill country plant, but has some unique, interesting species associations. Kind of a medium-sized deciduous shrub, understory tree, kind of airy. Flowers before the leaves come out, so that should be happening pretty soon. And the leaves can smell kind of spicy when crushed, hence the name. The spice bush butterfly, swallowtail, is one of the species that uses this. The picture we have here is of a female, and they have a blue hind wing, which is maybe more common among swallowtails. There are several black ones with blue hind wings, but the male has kind of a pale green wash to its hind wing instead of blue, and is a little more distinct. The Promethea silk moth is another one that uses this. You can see it in picture of one, and I can't remember if that might be Lynne's hands. Is it my hands holding this one? And it's the female here is brown, and the male is kind of a very dark purpley blackish. Do we have one at the end? Okay, but it's a very different looking animal. And again, it has a nice ginormous green caterpillar. Blue mist flower, one of our favorites, as a nectar plant, and it also is a host plant. But it's a little deciduous shrub, soft stems, kind of a woody base. It blooms these great late season purplish blue flowers, and lots of butterflies will come to this as a nectar plant. And a couple butterflies use this, and a moth or two. The rounded metalmark uses this species. It's kind of hard to, these little metal marks are kind of hard to identify. There's maybe 3 or 4 in the state that are all very similar looking in this genus, but they do all have different host plants that they use. So you can kind of isolate them by what they're on. And the yellow-winged parakeetes is kind of a unique little day-flying moth. That's kind of a cool little yellow, kind of a tiger moth type. And it's got a good looking caterpillar as well. Let's see. And mistletoe. Speaking of maligned plants, mistletoe. Who would think that mistletoe would be useful? But there are some plants, or there are some butterflies and moths that specifically like this. These rounded masses are kind of parasitic in mainly deciduous trees. There's a few species of mistletoe around the state, but this one's the most common. The male and female flowers occur on different plants. The seeds are spread by birds, and they will deposit seeds on branches, and it takes a few years for that seed to germinate and grow some sort of a root system in the branch before it actually pops out with foliage. And another one of our favorite butterflies in the area that uses this is the great purple hair streak. And it mainly perches with its wings closed, which is still a good looking butterfly with mainly black with a little brilliant blue and red spotting. But if you catch it in flight with the wings open, it's that brilliant blue on the top side. Very good looking. And this little moth, the beloved Emarginia, is a moth that'll use mistletoe, kind of a green, black, and white little guy. Cute. Sinizo. Here's a common landscaping plant around Texas. A lot of people use this, sometimes known as Brahminer bush. It'll bloom kind of sporadically depending on when it gets rain or humidity. And there are several species of leucophyllum around the state, some used as ornamentals. And they're very drought tolerant. They have this nice looking foliage and kind of a good plant to have around the yards. Yeah.
And a question from some audience, do all species of blue mist flower host or just other?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I think I know it. So does blue mist flower, there are a couple different plants that get called blue mist flower, and do the other ones also host these butterflies? And I would say the chances are, I'm not going to say that they definitely do, but it's possible that they do. I was trying to be pretty specific looking up which species and genus were using what, but it's been a while since I've looked at those on here. There are a couple other blue mist flower type things. They may eat it, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. That's not a great answer, but I'm going to stick with that one as a hedge. It's possible that they do, but I can't guarantee it. So the butterflies and moths we have on here, Theona checker spot uses Sinizo. And then the Coletta silk moth, which is South Texas, West Texas silk moth. Big, and has a good looking large caterpillar. They have some of these Colettas actually on the grounds here. I think generally some years more than others maybe, but they have in the past at least had that silk moth here, but it's more or less a southern species and out in West Texas. And it will eat a few more things than Sunitzo. It'll actually eat, if you're familiar with it, Ocotillo. Out in the Big Bend region, caterpillar will eat Ocotillo. So here's a good looking little vine. I love these milkweed vines. Can't get enough of these milkweed vines. Whether it's the pearl milkweed, that genus, the Madelias, or these twine vines, the funastrums. These are really good looking little vines. But this is a nice little trailing twining vine, has these arrowhead shaped leaves. And the flower clusters are just gorgeous with the pinks and whites and purples. So as you might guess, being a milkweed, but butterflies in the monarch group would eat this. So we've highlighted soldier, which is in the same genus as monarch, as one that will use this. And then this obscure sphinx, which is a tiny, for a sphinx moth, it's the smallest one I'm aware of. It's pretty small, but it's got this bright orange hind wing that when you see it, it's kind of nice. But it's a small sphinx moth. But queen and monarch will also eat this, as well as some of the milkweed tussock moth, appropriately enough. So now I'm going to let my better looking, smarter half finish up here.
All right, I'm going to wrap up by taking you through a little bit about gardening for butterflies and moths. Some guidelines if you're trying to set up a garden. Plant the natives, because they are the things that are the insect's true host, and that's what they evolved with, and it'll be less work for you once they get established. Try not to use pesticides. As I mentioned before, they're equal opportunity killers. Use drip irrigation to get your plants started, and plant species in clusters. There's a couple reasons for this. One is they have similar needs, like sun or shade or water requirements, but also because if you plant in clusters, it provides something called flower constancy to insects. So if you're an insect that wants to either lay your eggs on the plant or nectar on the plant, you'll have a lot of it right there in one area, and you use less energy to be able to consume. Plant a variety of bloom types. There's different colors that attract different insects, different shapes, things that are sequential bloomers throughout the hot summer or through the fall. And don't forget night bloomers, things like Datura or Berlander's trumpets for some of the moths. Make sure you include both host plants and nectar plants so you feed every life cycle stage. Plan for density so you can suppress weeds and other unwanted species. And embrace imperfection, and I'll get to that on the next slide. But I came across this fact, and I thought it was really interesting, that yards make up about 50% of the total green space in the city of Austin. And just think about what the potential is there. Provide quality habitat if we got rid of our lawns and put all native plants in. Because of that thought, I always like to think of native plant gardeners as small-scale conservationists. Because as mentioned in the introduction, you don't have to have a lot of land. You can still provide quite a bit in just a little pocket. In terms of embracing imperfection, doing less really does benefit wildlife. If you rake and blow and cut constantly and deadhead and prune back and dig, you can actually damage what you have worked hard to attract. There are things that actually pupate in the leaf litter and in the soil. So leave the leaves if you can. Many of them overwinter there. If you can rake them up into a pile in the corner of your yard or use them as mulch under your bushes and other shrubs, so that those larvae that you may not notice can survive the winter. It's also a place for brown skinks and other reptiles. So it's really important to leave it and try not to make things too perfect. Do a careful cutback. As a matter of fact, my back is still tired because we just did our cutback. We always do it very late winter or early spring because we like to leave the seeds for wildlife. We would like to carefully look and make sure we're not cutting down or getting rid of any overwintering cocoons or chrysalises. And you can also use plants like frostweed or coneflowers and cut the stems about 8–10 inches from the ground, because if they're hollow, solitary bees can use them as nesting sites. So don't cut anything all the way back, and certainly don't cut them back before the last freeze of the season. Now, things like tree sap and dew and nectar actually provide moisture for butterflies and moths, but you can also supplement that through a couple of different ways. One of them is puddling. So you could create a puddling area by taking a dish or just a shallow area in your yard and put some sand or some crushed granite and keep it moist. Don't waterlog it, but just keep it moist, and butterflies will actually come and get minerals from that. You can create a butterfly bait, and there are many different recipes online, but basically you take a food processor or a blender, you put overripe bananas in it, a little bit of beer, molasses, brown sugar. Jim doesn't ever like to put beer in it, because, fruit juice, things like that. And you just mix it up into this kind of gruel, and you put it in a glass jar. Don't put a top on it. Put it in a hot place like your garage where other critters can't get at it, and let it ferment for about a week. And then what you do is you take a paintbrush or a spoon and you either fill a dish with it or paint it on trees at eye level, especially along a trail. This is a great thing to do with kids. And then at night, go out with a flashlight and see what you've attracted. It's a great way to find out what's actually in your yard, especially at night if you're not out there patrolling all night long. Another thing you can do, and we do this fairly regularly, is you can blacklight. Moths are what's called positively phototactic, or they're attracted to different wavelengths of light. So you create a trap or a light trap by putting up a mercury vapor light or a black light in front of a white sheet, or even just a light colored wall, and you'll attract things. We usually turn ours on around dusk and leave it on until dawn. And throughout the night, things will come by and we can take pictures of them. We also rear things. We're not so ambitious that we actually rear caterpillars, but we will either find in the wild or buy cocoons from a reputable source. And we actually keep them in the crisper drawer of our refrigerator all throughout the fall. We're about to take them out right now and put them in these screen cages on our back porch. And then in about a month, they'll start emerging, and we can take pictures of things and release them. Now, we only take species that actually we have the host plants for, so species that are native to the region. And you'll see we get help from our little kitties there, Sam and Jesse, and that's a Cecropia moth. That gives you a good idea of scale. All right, now I mentioned we take photographs, and a lot of times people have asked us, well, how do we actually get some of these photographs? Well, we'll show you one of our secrets. The photograph on the left is a male Io moth. We showed you the female. It has purplish forewings earlier, but that's a male Io moth. It's on the stucco wall of our back porch. And I took a picture with my 35mm camera and just a single flash. And it looks kind of muddy. The background's shiny. There's a little bit of a shadow behind the antenna and the wings. So what do you do about that? Well, a good friend of ours developed this technique called a white box, and you can see that in the upper right. And basically it has 5 flashes that are synchronized. So every time you press the shutter on your camera, it puts them all out at once so that it evenly lights your subject. And we use black velvet for the background. Get something that's called a plamp to hold a stick or another substrate, and we can take photographs. So the same species moth there, the male Io moth, you can see the picture on the lower right. And by the way, one of the things we do is once these moths emerge, we actually put them in a small container and put them in the refrigerator for about a half an hour to slow their metabolism. And that way we can place them in the white box, and we can actually position them to some degree, and we can work with them for about 5 minutes before they actually really start warming up and really want to get away from us and from our cats. So I'm just going to finish by going through some pictures of some of the moths we've taken that way. This is the Cecropia moth. And the inset there, you can see the actual size of this moth. It's on my hand. This is the Prometheus silk moth. Jim showed you the female. This is the male. He's much darker, almost a purple black. The Polyphemus moth. There is a similar moth out in West Texas called the Oculea, or the Western Polyphemus moth. And the only real difference is the scales have a little different coloring, and the big eye spots on the hind wings have a little different coloring, but otherwise they're very similar. This is the regal moth, or the royal walnut moth, and this was taken in the white box just on the white with no background. That's, by the way, what Amazon does for all their products. It's taking them pictures of them on white backgrounds. The Coletta silk moth, we showed you this. This uses the Sinizo. The Forbes silk moth, this is a South Texas specialty that's actually quite rare. And it, those kind of triangular shaped, kind of very pale green spots are like windows. They're actually translucent. The Rocky Mountain agapima. This is a West Texas moth, and we took this picture in Austin, and then we had friends drive it out to West Texas to let it go so that it would have some hope. We're kind of soft-hearted. The imperial moth, which is one of the local ones here, fairly widespread in the state. And of course, most people's favorite, the Luna moth. And this was taken on a piece of escarpment black cherry bark that we took off of a tree in our property that had died, but the bark was curling off. So we use it as a photography substrate. So that's it. So thanks very much for your attention.
Do have time for questions? We'll take online questions too. Please repeat the question.
Hi, Dale.
You said you purchased chrysalis or cocoons from someplace, but I just didn't know you could do that.
Yes, there's a couple of online places that you can get them at. Dale was asking that I mentioned that we purchased cocoons, and he said, I didn't know you could do that. There's a couple of sources. One local source is the Austin Butterfly Forum. And a lot of people will actually bring cocoons and chrysalises of caterpillars they've reared just to trade or give away. Another source is places, I don't think BioEquip, maybe Carolina Biological Supply. They actually supply things for biology classes and biology teachers. But we actually have a contact that actually raises silk moths and several different species, butterflies as well. And he has a whole network of people throughout the United States, some of them here in Austin, that actually will rear caterpillars. And you can actually search online and find them and purchase them. And as we said, though, if you do that, please only buy things that you know can survive in the area. Up in the back. Oh, yes. I think, do you mean this one? Yes. Yeah, that's the Forbes silk moth. That's actually not too small. It's probably 4 to 5 inch wingspan. And yes, we did buy this one, and we did release it in South Texas. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really just down in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Santa Ana, Sable Palm, the places along the river down there, the woods down there is really about the only place you'll find it.
What's the host plant for that?
Prickly ash. I
Yeah.
didn't include it this time, but I think it's the
Lime prickly ash.
lime prickly ash down that way. One of the xynoxanthums. Or what?
Yes. Oh, yes.
What's your go-to camera?
Uh-oh.
Jim's more the
What's
what-
what camera do we use?
Canon.
We use Canon 5D Mark IVs. We've been using them for a while now. We're probably about ready to bite the bullet and switch over to mirrorless, but been having some heartache over trading out lenses and all. So I haven't done that yet, but if we do, we'll probably get the R5 Canon. I think will be our next camera.
We find that for nature subjects, we think that Canon is a little better. If you're doing portraits, most people use Nikon, people portraits. We don't do people portraits.
Yeah, we probably have 150,000 photographs, images on our computer, and I'd guess probably 100 of them are people.
And maybe 2 of them are of us.
We have a whole bunch more of our cats than we have of people.
Yes, an online question?
Okay, so several from the online.
Oh, sure.
We'll have to repeat these because I hopefully don't, but, the first one is there any mapping of butterfly moth ranges for the ranges of their host plants?
Yes, to a degree, that's what we tried to.
Oh.
Oh, I thought you said I didn't have to repeat it. Do you want me to repeat it? Okay, the question was, is there any mapping of ranges of a host plant with the range of the butterfly or moth species? And that's a yes and no. For example, what we tried to do in the book was map where the plants existed, and the likelihood of then the butterfly or moth existing is pretty high there. That does not mean that you wouldn't find it outside of that range. For example, the black witch moth, that the money bat, remember the Mariposa de la Muerte? It many times will after a storm, it will actually fly very far north, as far north as Canada. And there might not be any ebony trees there or any other host plants there.
Acacias or something that
Right.
they use.
But the adults, again, that's a silk moth, the adults don't eat. So it isn't impossible to find moths outside of the plant's range, especially if they're adults.
But
Caterpillar's a little different.
sorry, I'll give you an example of one that you won't find anywhere else other than where the host plant is, and that's the Big Bend scrub hair streak. It's very specific, and it will eat Hechia texensis, the Texas false agave. That's the only plant it eats. So you will only find it in areas where that plant grows. So many of these butterflies and moths do eat other things. So there's not necessarily direct mapping for a specific plant to the butterfly range, because in Oklahoma, it may eat something else.
Right. So probably the most accurate mapping you could get is if you took every known plant that a particular butterfly or moth species might eat as a caterpillar and map that to different counties in the US, and that would probably give you a good idea of the range of the butterfly. But
And even that, there'll be climatological reasons why it may not occur any further north. The plants may exist further north, but the animal may not.
right.
So it's hard to really do that.
2 more online ones. The next one is, don't your cats harm the butterflies and moths?
The question is, don't our cats harm the butterflies and moths? Well, first of all, let's say we lost the gray and white one in December, unfortunately, of cancer. And we still have Sam, who is the fawn and white one. He's much more gentle. Jessie definitely was the huntress. But when we take photographs, we have the white box in a small spare room, and we shut the door and don't let them in while we're photographing, because you're right, they would. And we keep a butterfly net in there because many times it takes us too long to get a good picture and the thing's flying around the room before we can actually get a good photograph.
And they are 100% indoor only cats.
Yes.
They never go outside. Never been outside in their lives.
Why trees host the most or more than shrubs?
Well, I don't know. The question is, why do the trees host the most versus shrubs or any others? And my guess is going to be, I don't know this for a fact, it's just a matter of distribution. That, for example, you can find oaks everywhere just about in the US. They might be different species, but a lot of times oaks are relatively interchangeable, and they're probably the species that most butterflies and moths use the most. Do you have a thought on that, Jim?
Yeah.
Why trees?
It's just kind of evolved that way. It'd be hard to really say for sure why.
Hi, I know that there are 2 books. Do you guys have any of those with you today? Or you need to buy them?
We do not. There are, I think the bookstore carries a couple of them. They're on Amazon. They're on barnesandnoble.com. They're
On the publisher's website.
Texas A&M University Press website store has them.
We have a 10% discount.
Yeah, and yeah,
Yeah, Meg is telling us that the native host plants for butterflies and moths, I know you've had them in the gift shop before. There might still be some, and if you do go today with your attendance here, that you get a 10% discount. And then Naturalist Austin, up until the end of April, you'll get a 20% discount on that.
through the A&M
Through
website.
the A&M website.
QR code up there.
Great, yeah. So use the QR code for the A&M discount.
Let me get him back there and then I'll come to you. The question is, do we have an interest to collaborate with someone else in a different state to do similar books? Interesting, you should say that. The answer is yes, short answer. The longer answer is we've actually kind of outlined a book for New Mexico. And that's something that we're considering doing. We're on, so I'll just leave it at that. But if you are interested, you can get in touch with us at naturewatch@austin.rr.com. Yes.
Curious about the relationship between yuccas and moths.
Hmm.
Hear about that, but I didn't know if you guys.
A little bit.
Yeah, we did look into that a little.
The question is the relationship between yuccas and moths. Do you want to talk about the moths or the yucca giant skipper?
Well, I'll take a short pass at what I remember about the moths. The moths have become very rare, and I think in at least around here, the yuccas almost never get pollinated by those moths anymore because they just aren't around. Now I don't know if they were, I can't remember if the yucca moths were actually just using them for pollination or if they were actually the host plants too, because this was something we didn't include in our books, but that has been studied and it's kind of a problem. The yucca giant skippers, which I'll segue into something we do know something about. The yucca giant skippers are specific to certain yuccas and agaves. There's several species across the state. The ones in central Texas, the yucca giant skipper and Strecker's giant skipper, will use the twistleaf yucca. There's some others out in West Texas that are specific to different agaves and yuccas out there, but around here, the twistleaf yucca gets these too, and the adult giant skipper doesn't eat. It's like the silk moths that way. It's a very robust giant skipper, hence the name. And it'll lay 1 or 2 eggs on a leaf of a twistleaf yucca, and the caterpillar will bore down into the root system, deep into the root system, and will live there. It'll overwinter as a larva, chewing away in the roots. It makes this little tent structure out of plant material and silk that covers the entrance to where it went in. And if you get tuned into what you're looking for, you can spot those. And then it'll pupate in the spring and emerge March, April, late March, early April. It'll emerge as an adult out of the yucca plant. Occasionally, if the yucca is not very big or something, it might kill the yucca, but if it's a more robust plant, it won't. But they are very fascinating little guys, and they're hard to find as a adult or a caterpillar. We
In fact,
have,
the way we found the caterpillars, we had to go with a friend of ours to dig up a yucca about 3 feet down. We cut out a piece of root about this big, and then every inch or so, we'd make more cuts until we found a chamber. And then we actually got the caterpillar out of that chamber.
our friend
And then-
was rearing them for subsequent release.
How we'd gotten pictures of adults before, since they're hard to get in the wild, is we actually had some of those caterpillars. We reared them after they pupated. We put them in little tiny tubes made out of toilet paper tubes with cotton on either end. And then when they emerged, we pulled them down and took pictures of them, and let them go. But they're a pretty rare,
Yeah.
pretty
They are
rare
strong
species.
flyers too. They are very strong flyers.
If y'all do have for a number of years, a wonderful job of submitting articles to our homeowners association. And it's such a good, interesting thing for the neighbors that don't know much about this. And I love it and have appreciated it so much. Do you have a method in which articles like this can go to other homeowners groups across the state or wherever?
Well, the question is, Pat Beulah had mentioned that since 2008, we have been doing monthly nature watch articles in our neighborhood newsletter on things you can see in nature around the area, including photographs. And they actually do appear in our neighborhood newsletter, and the publisher puts them in other neighborhood newsletters in the Austin area. But we have not done any outside of that particular area. And as a matter of fact, a collection of those articles were what our first book was made out of.
One quick last question.
Given the preponderance of moth species, the butterfly species in Texas, are moths doing more pollinating than butterflies? Or
Yeah, the question is, given that there's so many more moth species than butterfly species in the state, are moths doing more pollinating? And I just read a research paper on that, and it was actually research that was done in the UK. But the answer is yes, because worldwide there are more moth species than there are butterfly species. They're just not as well studied. They're not as interesting. They're not generally nocturnal. Many of them are micromoths, which are
Yeah, a
tiny,
lot of them are very small.
hard to identify, hard to find. But yes, moths are actually pollinating more so than they feel than even butterflies or bees. I think that's it. All right. Thank you.
This photo on the bottom of that hair streak reminds me, if you're a bird watcher, if you can tell the sparrows apart, you're a real bird watcher. And if you can tell the hair streaks apart, you're good on butterflies. So thank y'all for that.